the party that turned into a nightmare. It was supposed to be just another night, nothing special. Tom had invited a few of us over to his house while his parents were out of town. Nothing crazy, just a group of close friends hanging out, drinking, and having a good time. I'd been looking forward to it all week, getting a break from work and college stress. It was supposed to be fun. But fun was the last thing on my mind by the time the night was over. There were about 10 of us at the party, the usual crowd. Music blared through the speakers, and the laughter was loud enough to drown out any outside noise. We were too wrapped up in the drinks and conversation to notice much else until Anna tugged on my sleeve. "Hey," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Did you see that?" "See what?" I laughed, but the look on her face stopped me. "What are you talking about?" She pointed toward the sliding glass door that led out to the backyard. It was dark outside, with just the faintest light from the patio lamps illuminating the yard. Beyond that, there was nothing but the woods. "I swear I saw someone standing by the trees," Anna muttered, her eyes wide, right there, just watching us. My stomach dropped. A wave of unease washed over me, but I brushed it off. We'd all had a few drinks, and my first thought was that Anna was just seeing things. Maybe a trick of the light, or one of the guys messing around. I shook it off and told her it was probably nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the night wore on, I kept glancing toward the backyard, and every time I did, my heart pounded harder. I didn't see anything, just the dark outline of the trees swaying in the breeze. But that feeling, that gut-wrenching feeling, kept gnawing at me. Then Tom stormed into the living room, looking pale. "Who the hell went into my parents' room?" he demanded, his voice shaking. We all exchanged confused glances. No one had been upstairs. Tom's face tightened. "I heard footsteps up there. And I'm not messing around. Someone's been in their room." A cold wave of dread shot through me. Tom wasn't the type to joke, especially about something like that. The party came to a standstill as everyone realized something was seriously wrong. A few of us went with him upstairs. The house was deadly silent, the kind of silence that presses on your chest, making it hard to breathe. When we got to his parents' bedroom, the door was slightly ajar. Tom pushed it open slowly, and we all peered inside. The window was wide open, the curtains blowing in the breeze. "I locked that window," Tom muttered, his face pale. "I know I locked it." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. My heart leapt into my throat as the sound of shattering glass filled the house. It was followed by muffled screams, someone yelling, someone panicking. We rushed back down the stairs, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I could barely move, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to believe. When we reached the living room, my stomach lurched. The sliding glass door was smashed to pieces, the glass scattered all over the floor. Cold night air rushed into the house, bringing with it a chilling sense of dread. But that wasn't the worst part. Everyone else was gone. Where did everyone go?" Anna whispered, her voice barely audible, eyes wide with panic. I tried calling their names, but the words got caught in my throat. All I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. My head was spinning, my chest tight. I couldn't process what was happening. And then, through the shattered door, I saw it. A figure. Just standing there. Right at the edge of the woods. It wasn't moving. It wasn't doing anything. Just watching. "Tom," I could barely get the words out. "Call the police. Now." His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone. But before he could dial, we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy, coming from somewhere inside the house. We froze. My skin prickled with fear, every muscle in my body tense. Something was inside the house with us. The footsteps got closer, echoing in the silence. We didn't wait to see who it was. We grabbed knives from the kitchen and locked ourselves in the nearest bathroom. My hands trembled so hard I nearly dropped the knife. The bathroom was small, and it felt like the walls were closing in on us. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind racing with terrifying thoughts. The pounding of footsteps outside the door was the only thing I could hear, getting louder and louder. Suddenly, they stopped. I held my breath, staring at the crack of light under the door. And then, I saw a shadow. Someone was standing right outside the door, just inches away from us. I covered my mouth, trying to keep quiet, but my heart was racing so fast I thought it would give me away. Whoever it was, they stayed there for what felt like an eternity, just standing, just waiting. Then, the shadow moved away. The footsteps retreated, and the silence that followed was almost worse than the sound. We didn't dare move, not until we heard the distant wail of police sirens cutting through the night. When they arrived, they found the others hiding in the garage, pale and shaking. They had seen someone lurking just beyond the tree line, and when they tried to come inside, the door had been locked behind them. They broke the glass in a panic. But the person we saw, the shadow that moved through the house, the figure in the woods, they never found him. The police searched, but there were no footprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. To this day, I still don't know what happened. But that feeling of being watched, of someone creeping just out of sight, still haunts me. I'll never forget the way that shadow stood outside the bathroom door, waiting, as if it knew something we didn't. Trapped in her own home, a true story. It was supposed to be a typical Friday night. Katie, a 24-year-old woman living alone in a suburban house, had planned to spend the evening relaxing after a long week at work. She ordered takeout, put on her favorite TV show, and settled in for what she thought would be an uneventful night. The neighborhood was quiet, as it usually was. A perfect, peaceful place to live, or so she thought. The first unsettling thing happened around 10 p.m. She had just finished dinner when she heard a knock at the door. Not the quick, casual kind you hear from someone stopping by, but slow, deliberate knocks, like someone was testing to see if she was home. Katie's stomach tightened. She wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, she saw a man standing there wearing a hoodie pulled low over his face. His hands were in his pockets, and he didn't look like anyone from the neighborhood. She didn't open the door. Instead, she stood perfectly still, hoping he would think she wasn't home and leave. But he didn't leave. Instead, he knocked again, louder this time, more insistent. Katie's heart raced, her mind racing through all the possibilities. Could he be lost? Maybe he had the wrong house? But then she remembered something, a news report about a string of break-ins nearby, where the intruders would knock to see if anyone was home before forcing their way inside. After a long moment, the knocking stopped. Katie waited in silence, her ear pressed to the door. Nothing. Slowly, she exhaled, convincing herself that he was gone. But just to be safe, she double-checked that all the doors were locked and every window was shut tight. Then she heard the scraping. It was coming from the back of the house, near the kitchen door. Panic surged through her. She grabbed her phone and quietly moved toward the back of the house. As she peeked through the blinds of the back door, her blood ran cold. The man was there, trying to pry open the door with what looked like a crowbar. Katie's hands trembled as she dialed 911, her voice barely above a whisper as she told the operator what was happening. The operator assured her that the police were on their way, but Katie knew it would take them time to get there. And the man was already trying to get inside. She crept back toward the living room, her mind racing. She had nowhere to go. If the man got in through the kitchen, she'd be trapped. Her heart pounded in her chest, every second stretching out, the sound of her own breathing echoing in her ears. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. Katie's breath caught in her throat as she listened, hoping the man had given up. But then, a loud crash shattered the silence. He had broken the glass on the kitchen door. Panic surged through her like a jolt of electricity. She needed to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The man was inside now. She could hear his footsteps moving through the kitchen, slowly, like he was taking his time. He was searching for her. Katie ran into her bedroom and locked the door behind her. She slid into the closet, pulling clothes over herself in a desperate attempt to stay hidden. Her entire body shook as she heard the man's footsteps coming down the hallway, getting closer and closer. And then he stopped right outside her bedroom door. Katie's heart felt like it would explode out of her chest. She clamped a hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. The door handle rattled, followed by a sharp knock. "Katie," a voice said from the other side. Her blood ran cold. How did he know her name? "Katie," the voice repeated, slow and menacing. "I know you're in there." She wanted to scream, to cry, but she couldn't make a sound. The door rattled again, harder this time, as if the man was testing the lock. She could hear his breathing on the other side, slow and heavy, like he was savoring the moment. She thought it was over. She thought any second now the door would fly open, and he would find her huddled in the closet. Then the sound of sirens cut through the night. The man's footsteps retreated quickly, followed by the sound of the back door slamming shut. Katie didn't dare move until she heard the police banging on the front door. Even then, it took everything she had to crawl out of the closet and unlock the door for them. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. They searched the area but found nothing. He had disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the shattered glass and the memory of his voice calling her name. Katie moved out of that house a week later. The police never caught the man, and she never found out how he knew her name. To this day, she can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, waiting. And she'll never forget the sound of his voice on the other side of that door, knowing he was inches away from her, and knowing that if those sirens hadn't come when they did, she might not be here to tell the story. The Night Caller, a true story. I don't talk about it much anymore, but it's something that happened to me when I was 22. I was living on my own for the first time in a small, run-down apartment just outside of town. It wasn't the nicest area, but it was what I could afford. The neighbors mostly kept to themselves, and I liked the solitude. I worked late shifts at a restaurant, so I'd get home around midnight most nights, exhausted and ready to crash. It started with a phone call. It was a Wednesday night. I had just gotten home from work, kicked off my shoes, and was about to settle in when my phone rang. The number was blocked. I wouldn't normally pick up, but something about that night. I don't know. I was already on edge, so I answered. "Hello?" Silence. "Hello," I repeated, already regretting picking up. Then, a voice. Low, almost a whisper. "I see you." I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. What I managed to say, my voice shaky. The caller didn't respond right away. I could hear breathing on the other end, slow and deliberate. "You're wearing a red sweater." I was. I looked down at myself, dread creeping up my spine. I hung up immediately, my hands trembling. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank. Someone saw me walking into my building and decided to mess with me. It had to be that. But still, I locked every door and window in the apartment before crawling into bed that night. Sleep didn't come easy. The next night, the phone rang again. Same blocked number. This time I didn't pick up, but as soon as it stopped ringing, a text came through. "Why won't you answer me?" I didn't respond. Instead, I turned my phone off and tried to focus on anything else. But the paranoia was setting in. How did they know what I was wearing last night? Had they been watching me? I checked the windows again, scanning the street outside, but everything looked normal. The third night was worse. I came home late again, and as I unlocked my door, my phone rang. I didn't even look at it. I was shaking, fumbling with my keys. I slammed the door behind me, locking it as fast as I could, but the phone kept ringing. When it finally stopped, another text came through. "I'm closer than you think." I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? That someone was calling me from a blocked number, sending vague, creepy texts. They'd probably brush it off as some prank. I convinced myself again that it was nothing, but deep down I knew I was lying to myself. The fourth night I saw him. I got home around midnight, like usual, but as I turned the corner toward my building, I saw a figure standing near the entrance. At first I thought it was just another tenant, maybe someone waiting for a ride, but as I got closer I realized he wasn't moving. Just standing there, staring at my building. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, the hood pulled low over his face. I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew he was watching me. My stomach turned, and I felt my legs go weak. I didn't want to walk past him, but I didn't have a choice. My building was right there. I swallowed my fear and walked toward the door, pretending I hadn't noticed him. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. As I fumbled for my keys, I glanced over my shoulder. He was still standing there, maybe 10 feet away, silent still, watching. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely lock it. I turned off all the lights in the apartment and peeked out the window. He was still there, standing under the streetlight, looking up at my building. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I went to the police. I told them everything, the calls, the texts, the man outside my building. They took it seriously, to my surprise, and said they'd send someone to check the area. But when I got home that night, nothing felt different. The fear was still there, gnawing at me. I locked myself in, triple-checking every window, every door. I didn't even bother turning on my phone. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard a noise. It was faint at first, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. My heart was racing. The noise was coming from outside my bedroom window. I lived on the 3rd floor. No one could be out there. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a lamp, and slowly crept toward the window. The scraping continued, louder now, like someone was dragging something metal against the glass. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out. He was there, standing on the fire escape, his face inches from the glass. The man in the hoodie. I screamed and stumbled back, dropping the lamp. I could hear him tapping on the window now, slow and deliberate. Tap, 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 tap. I ran to the living room, grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The operator picked up, but I could barely speak. I was hysterical, babbling about the man on the fire escape, begging them to send someone, anyone. Within minutes I heard the sirens, but when the police arrived, the man was gone. The fire escape was empty, no sign of him. The officers searched the area, but there was nothing to find. They told me it was likely someone had been stalking me, but they couldn't do much without more evidence. They suggested I stay with a friend for a while, and I took their advice. I moved out of that apartment a month later. I never saw him again. But sometimes late at night, when I'm alone, I think about him, about how close he was, how long he had been watching me, waiting. And I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't seen him that night. If I hadn't woken up to that sound, would he have come inside? Would he have hurt me? I'll never know. And maybe that's the scariest part. The broken down car. I don't know what made me take that road. It wasn't like we had any reason to be out there in the first place, just a quiet weekend getaway with Sarah, driving through the back roads, hoping to escape the noise of the city. We thought it would be peaceful, taking the scenic route. But as I sit here writing this, I can't stop thinking that something was out there with us, watching us, following us. It started with the car. 1 minute, everything was fine. We were listening to music, laughing about some dumb joke Sarah had made. The next, the engine made this weird noise, like it was choking, and then, nothing. The car just died. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying not to panic, but we both knew we were in the middle of nowhere. There was no cell service out there, no GPS, no way to call for help. The only thing we could do was walk. We figured there had to be a town or a gas station somewhere along the road, so we grabbed a flashlight and started walking. It was getting dark fast. The sun had already dipped behind the trees, and the temperature was dropping. I remember Sarah was shivering, pulling her jacket tighter around her, and I felt this nagging sense of guilt. This was supposed to be a fun trip. Now we were stranded on some dirt road in the middle of the forest with no idea how far we had to go. After about 20 minutes, that's when we first heard it. A rustling sound like someone or something moving in the bushes just off the road. I stopped walking, holding the flashlight out in front of me, scanning the trees. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. "Probably just an animal," she said, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. We both knew something felt off. We kept walking, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled over us. But the rustling continued, always just out of sight, just beyond the reach of the flashlight. At first it was faint, like the wind moving through the leaves. But the longer we walked, the louder it became. Footsteps, maybe. I wasn't sure. But whatever it was keeping pace with us. I stopped again, shining the light into the trees. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer, just the sound of the wind. But I could feel it. Someone was watching us. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "Let's just keep moving," she whispered. "Maybe we'll find help soon." We started walking faster, our footsteps crunching on the gravel road. But no matter how fast we went, the sound in the bushes stayed with us, always just behind, always close enough to hear but too far to see. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the forest was playing tricks on me. But then I saw it, a shadow darting between the trees, too fast for me to make out any details, but big enough to send a chill down my spine. "Did you see that?" I asked, my heart racing. Sarah didn't answer. She was staring straight ahead, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. We both started running. It wasn't a decision, it was instinct. Something was out there, something that didn't want us on that road. I could feel it now, the presence in the trees, the eyes watching us, tracking our every move. My legs were burning, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. After what felt like hours, we saw a house just up ahead. It was old, run down with no lights on, but it was the first sign of civilization we'd seen since the car broke down. We sprinted toward it, not caring who lived there, just desperate for help. I banged on the door, yelling for anyone inside. There was no answer. The house looked abandoned, windows boarded up, the front yard overgrown. But at that moment I didn't care. We pushed open the door and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. For a while we just stood there, panting, trying to catch our breath. The house smelled musty, like it hadn't been lived in for years. But it was shelter, and for the first time since the car broke down, I felt a flicker of hope. Then we heard it. The rustling. It was outside now, circling the house. Footsteps slow and deliberate, crunching on the leaves outside. We stayed completely still, listening, our breaths shallow. "Do you think it's still out there?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded. I didn't want to say it, but I knew whatever was out there hadn't left. It was waiting for us. We waited, frozen in place, listening to the footsteps. They moved around the house, stopping at the windows. Every now and then I'd hear a soft tap, like something or someone was checking to see if the windows would open. But they were boarded up, and I prayed they would hold. Hours passed, and the footsteps finally faded. The rustling stopped. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe, that whatever was out there was still watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. We stayed in that house until morning. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the boards, we left. We didn't bother going back to the car. We just walked as fast as we could until we found a gas station miles down the road. When we told the clerk what had happened, he just shook his head. "You're lucky you made it out of those woods," he said. "Not everyone does." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to know. Sarah and I never talked about that night again. We went back to the city, back to our normal lives, but I can't forget what happened out there. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear that sound, the rustling in the bushes, the soft footsteps, and I wonder if it's still out there watching, waiting for me to come back. The mysterious neighbor. When I first moved into my apartment, the neighborhood seemed perfect. It was quiet, close to work, and the rent was cheap, a rare find in the city. Most of the people in the building were friendly, or at the very least, they kept to themselves. I liked that. After years of dealing with noisy roommates in cramped spaces, I was ready for some peace and quiet. At least that's what I thought. It was about a week after I moved in that I first noticed him. My new neighbor. He lived 2 doors down in 3C, and while I hadn't seen him during my initial tour of the place, it wasn't long before I caught sight of him. It was in the hallway, late one evening. I had just finished unloading a few boxes and was taking out the trash when I saw him standing by the door of his apartment. He was tall, with a gaunt frame and hollow eyes that seemed too big for his face. His clothes were wrinkled and looked like they hadn't been washed in days. At first, I thought he was just another city oddball, someone who kept to himself, which was fine by me. But the way he looked at me was unsettling. He didn't say a word, just stood there, staring as I walked past him. His eyes followed me all the way down the hall. I nodded and muttered a polite hello, but he didn't respond, just stared. I brushed it off. Maybe he was shy, or maybe he didn't speak English. It wasn't a big deal. But after that night, I started seeing him more often and always in the strangest places. I'd be coming back from work, and he'd be standing in the lobby, not doing anything, just standing there, like he was waiting for someone. Or I'd be taking out the trash, and he'd be sitting on the steps outside, staring into the distance. Every time I saw him, he had the same blank, hollow expression, like he was somewhere else entirely. And no matter where I was, his eyes always found me, always locked onto mine with a kind of grim intensity that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just that he was there, though it was when and how he appeared. One night I was coming home late after a work event. It was around midnight, and the building was mostly dark. As I reached my door, I saw him again, standing at the end of the hallway. This time he was closer than usual, just a few steps away from my door. I froze, my keys halfway to the lock. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stared at me. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is everything okay?" No response. Just that same empty look, his eyes fixed on me like I was the only thing in the world. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding, and for the first time since moving in, I didn't feel safe. From that point on, things started to escalate. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain that I'd heard footsteps outside my door. At first, I told myself it was just the normal sounds of the building, people coming and going, pipes creaking, the wind rattling the windows. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't normal at all. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, stopping right outside my door for minutes at a time before fading away. One night, I built up the courage to look through the peephole. Sure enough, there he was, my neighbor, standing just outside my door, not moving, not knocking, just standing there, staring at the door like he could see me through it. I held my breath, too afraid to move, too afraid to even blink, until finally, after what felt like hours, he turned and walked away. I started avoiding him after that, taking different routes to my apartment and timing my comings and goings to make sure I wouldn't run into him. But it didn't matter. He always found me. One evening, I was heading to the laundry room in the basement when I heard a noise behind me. I turned, and there he was, standing at the top of the stairs, watching me. My heart raced, but I tried to act casual, continuing down the stairs as if I hadn't seen him. When I reached the laundry room, I threw my clothes into the machine as quickly as I could, all the while feeling like someone was watching me. When I finally looked up, he was standing in the doorway. My throat went dry. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaky. This time he spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I didn't know what to say. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. "You shouldn't be here," he repeated, his eyes boring into mine. "This isn't your place." My stomach dropped. I grabbed my things and bolted past him, not stopping until I was back in my apartment with the door locked behind me. I didn't sleep that night, and the next morning I called the building manager. I explained everything, the staring, the strange appearances, the footsteps outside my door. The manager seemed concerned at first, but when I mentioned the apartment number 3C, his expression changed. He told me, in no uncertain terms, that I was mistaken. "There's no one living in 3C, he said. "That apartment's been empty for months." I froze. "That's impossible. I've seen him. He's there all the time." The manager shook his head. "I don't know what you've been seeing, but 3C is vacant. No one's lived there since the last tenant moved out, and that was almost a year ago." I didn't know what to say. It didn't make any sense. I'd seen him. He was real. But the look on the manager's face told me he wasn't lying. He even offered to show me the apartment. I agreed, still shaken but desperate for answers. When we opened the door to 3C, it was exactly as the manager had said, completely empty. The walls were bare, the floors dusty, and there was no sign that anyone had been living there for a long time. I stared at the empty space where I had seen my neighbor standing just days before, feeling a cold chill crawl up my spine. I moved out 2 weeks later. I couldn't stay there. Not after everything that had happened. I don't know who or what I had been seeing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That wherever I went, those hollow eyes would be watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the slow, deliberate footsteps, just outside my door. Rumors and testimonies. When you live in a small town long enough, you start to hear the rumors, the strange whispers that circulate from one neighbor to the next. Stories told in hushed tones over a pint at the local bar, or while shopping at the grocery store. Most people dismiss them, chalking them up to the eccentricities of rural life, where tall tales are spun for amusement. But every so often, one of those stories sticks with you. It gnaws at the back of your mind, refusing to be forgotten. That's what happened to me with the stories about Hollow Creek. For years, there have been whispers about the woods surrounding the creek just outside town. People said it wasn't like other places, that strange things happened there. Livestock would go missing without a trace, dogs would refuse to go near it, and there were always rumors of strange figures seen wandering between the trees late at night. Some said it was haunted, others thought there were wild men living deep in the forest. No one had ever been able to explain it, but the stories kept piling up. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. I'm not one for ghost stories or conspiracy theories. But when I heard about yet another disappearance near Hollow Creek, something clicked. It wasn't just the stories anymore, it was the fact that people were going missing. The latest one was a guy named Mark Reeves, a local hiker, who knew the area like the back of his hand. He'd gone for a hike in the woods one Saturday afternoon, same as he'd done dozens of times before. He was expected home by sundown, but he never showed up. A search party combed the area, but there wasn't a single trace of him, no footprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing. He'd simply vanished. That was when I decided to dig deeper. If there was something out there in those woods, I wanted to know what it was. The first place I started was with the town's history. It wasn't hard to find old newspaper clippings about Hollow Creek. The area had always had a reputation for being off. Back in the 1920s, there were reports of strange lights in the sky over the woods, seen by several farmers who lived nearby. In the 1950s, a local boy went missing for 3 days and was found wandering the edge of the creek, dazed and incoherent, with no memory of where he'd been or how he'd gotten there. The boy, now a grown man, still lives in town but refuses to talk about what happened. And then there were the rumors that Hollow Creek had been the site of occult rituals in the 1970s. A few teenagers claimed to have stumbled upon a group of robed figures chanting in a clearing near the creek, but when they brought the authorities to investigate, nothing was found. No evidence, no signs of a gathering, just the woods and the silence. I spoke to some of the older residents in town, those who had lived here long enough to have heard the stories firsthand. One woman, Mrs. Hadley, told me about her husband, who had been part of a search party back in 1985 after a hunter disappeared near the creek. She said he came back from the search looking pale and shaken and refused to ever set foot near those woods again. He never told her what he'd seen, only that it was wrong something about the way the forest felt, the way the trees seemed too quiet, too still. Then there were the testimonies of those who had experienced the more recent disturbances. A local truck driver swore he'd seen a figure in the road one night while driving past Hollow Creek, only for it to vanish into thin air as he got closer. He described it as a tall, gaunt figure with unnaturally long limbs, standing in the middle of the road like it was waiting for him. Another woman, a local teacher named Emily Porter, recounted a camping trip she and her family had taken near the creek about 5 years ago. She said that one night, while sitting around the campfire, they began to hear what sounded like a child crying in the distance. It started softly, but grew louder and more insistent, as if it was getting closer. Her husband went to investigate, but found nothing. The crying stopped as soon as he stepped away from the camp. They packed up and left the next morning, cutting their trip short. She said she hadn't camped since. There were other stories, 2 accounts of people seeing strange shadows moving between the trees, hearing footsteps when no one was there, feeling an oppressive sense of dread whenever they got too close to the creek. But the strangest account I found came from a man named Tom Weston, a retired sheriff's deputy who had once been assigned to the Hollow Creek area. He told me about an incident that had stuck with him all these years. One night, in the early 90s, he had been called out to investigate a disturbance near the creek. A local farmer had reported seeing lights moving through the trees, brighter than any flashlight or lantern. Weston and his partner drove out to check it out. They found no lights, but they did find something else large, circular impressions in the ground near the edge of the creek, as if something heavy had been resting there. There were no tracks leading in or out, just those strange impressions. He said it reminded him of the landing marks left behind by helicopters, except there had been no helicopters reported in the area that night. He had his own theory about Hollow Creek, though he admitted it sounded crazy. He believed there was something beneath the ground, something ancient, something that people had accidentally disturbed. Some places aren't meant for people, he told me. Hollow Creek's one of them. I don't know what I expected to find when I started looking into the rumors, but the deeper I dug, the more uneasy I became. There was something about the consistency of the stories, how they all seemed to line up, despite the decades separating them. The missing people, the strange sightings, the feeling of being watched, it all pointed to something more than just local superstition. I wasn't sure if I believed in the supernatural, but I couldn't ignore the fact that people had been disappearing near that creek for as long as anyone could remember. And whatever was out there, whatever was lurking in the shadows of Hollow Creek, it wasn't done yet. As for me, I'm not sure what to do next. I've thought about going into the woods myself, about trying to find whatever it is that's hiding out there. But every time I get close, I feel that same creeping dread, the same sense that something is watching me, waiting. Maybe Weston was right. Maybe some places just aren't meant for people. And maybe Hollow Creek is one of them. The stranger in the window. I've always liked living on the outskirts of town, quiet, surrounded by woods, and far from the noise of the city. My house stood at the end of a small neighborhood, right next to an old, abandoned house that had been empty for as long as I could remember. The owners had moved out in the 90s, leaving it to rot in the open air. Kids would sometimes sneak in out of curiosity, but no one really paid it much attention. At least I didn't until the night I saw someone in the window. It was late autumn, and I was sitting in my kitchen, scrolling through my phone, when I suddenly felt that odd sensation of being watched. At first I brushed it off, thinking it was just paranoia from being alone in a quiet house. But then I looked up through the window, which had a clear view of the old house next door. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw a dark figure standing perfectly still. I froze, my mind racing. No one had lived there for decades, and as far as I knew, the house had been locked up. But the figure was unmistakable, a shadowy outline of a person, staring directly in my direction. I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but the figure remained. For several minutes, I couldn't move. I stared back at the figure, trying to make sense of it. Then, as suddenly as I had noticed it, the figure stepped back into the darkness, disappearing from view. I tried to calm myself down, convincing myself it must have been some kind of optical illusion, or maybe a homeless person taking shelter for the night. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The image of that motionless figure burned into my mind, and no matter how much I wanted to forget it, I couldn't. The next few days passed uneventfully. I kept an eye on the old house, but I didn't see the figure again. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The logical part of me insisted that there had to be an explanation. Maybe someone had snuck into the house for shelter, or even as a prank. But another part of me, the part that had been unnerved by that eerie encounter, told me something else, something darker. Then, one night, I heard the footsteps. It was around 2 a.m. and I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard the distinct sound of creaking floorboards coming from the attic above my bedroom. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the sound continued. Slow, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth across the attic. My heart started to race as I lay there, frozen in bed, listening intently. I didn't keep anything in the attic, just old junk and boxes. There was no reason for anyone to be up there. But the footsteps continued, each creak growing louder and more deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was up there wanted me to know they were there. I gathered all my courage and slowly got out of bed, grabbing the flashlight from my nightstand. My hands were trembling as I made my way to the attic door, located at the end of the hallway. The footsteps stopped the moment I reached the door. I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, hesitating. Should I open it? Did I even want to know what was on the other side? Finally, I pushed the door open and shone the flashlight up into the attic. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the same dusty boxes and old furniture that had been there for years. No sign of anyone, no footprints, nothing. But the feeling that someone had been watching me, had been walking above me, lingered long after I shut the door and retreated to my room. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, things got worse. It started small. Doors that I was sure I'd closed were found open, objects went missing and then reappeared in strange places. And every night I heard those footsteps again, slow, deliberate, as if they were searching for something. One evening, after another restless night, I decided I had to check the old house again. Something was telling me that whatever or whoever I had seen in that window was connected to what was happening in my home. Armed with a flashlight and a heavy wrench, I made my way across the yard and toward the abandoned house. The front door was locked, just as I'd expected, but one of the windows on the side had been broken for years, and I climbed through it. The house was as cold and empty as I remembered, but there was a strange heaviness in the air that I hadn't noticed before. I could feel it pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I went upstairs, heading straight for the room where I'd seen the figure. The door was slightly ajar, and I nudged it open with the wrench. The room was empty, just like the rest of the house, but then I noticed something, a small, weathered photograph lying on the windowsill. I picked it up, my heart pounding. The photo was old, yellowed with age, but I could make out a man standing in front of what looked like my house. I felt a chill run down my spine. As I turned the photograph over, I saw a single word scrawled on the back in shaky handwriting: soon. At that moment, I heard the creak of a floorboard behind me. I spun around, but the room was still empty. Still, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever, and I could almost sense someone or something standing just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I left the house as quickly as I could and locked every door and window that night. But no matter what I did, the footsteps never stopped, and each night they came closer, closer, until I realized that the thing I saw in the window wasn't confined to the old house anymore. Now it was in mine. It was just a delivery, until it wasn't. I never thought I'd be scared of a simple package arriving at my door. I was always careful. I lived in a small apartment complex, and being a woman living alone, I never took any chances. But this time, I let my guard down. It started with a standard online order, nothing unusual. I was expecting a delivery that Friday afternoon. I got the usual email: your package will arrive today between 12 p.m. and 3 p.m. The company sent the delivery service's tracking number, so I followed it closely. At around 1:30 p.m. I heard the knock at the door, but something felt off. No usual buzzing from the intercom to let them in. I opened the door just a crack to see a man standing there with a package in his hand. He wore a cap pulled low, hiding most of his face, and a uniform that seemed a little off. It was wrinkled, almost like it had been worn for days, and there wasn't any logo on his shirt. "Delivery for Miss Johnson," he said, mispronouncing my last name. My stomach sank. The name was right, but I hadn't given my last name on the order. Just my initials. "Hey, can I see your ID?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even though my heart was pounding. He hesitated. "It's in the truck," he muttered. "You can sign for it, though." I felt the panic rising. I didn't want to open the door, but I also didn't want to make a scene. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe I was being ridiculous, but I noticed his shoes. Worn, scuffed, not the kind you'd see a professional courier wearing. "I'm sorry, I can't take it without seeing some ID," I said, trying to shut the door. He shoved the package toward the opening, forcing me to grab it out of reflex. His hand brushed mine for just a moment, and it felt cold, clammy. "Have a nice day," he said, backing away with a strange smile that didn't reach his eyes. I locked the door as soon as it closed. My pulse was racing, but I tried to rationalize that maybe he was just a weird guy, and I was overreacting. While I put the package down and didn't open it right away, the whole encounter kept replaying in my head, making me anxious. Hours passed. I couldn't shake the feeling, so I decided to check the tracking info again. My package wasn't supposed to arrive until the next day. That's when I noticed the noise, a slight rustling coming from inside the apartment. I froze, my eyes darting toward the package sitting in the hallway. Couldn't be, could it? Slowly I crept toward it, heart hammering in my chest. The sound got louder, like scratching, like something trying to escape. I was shaking. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. But before I could dial, the scratching stopped. Silence. For a moment I stood there, breathless. Then, with trembling hands, I tore open the package. Inside was nothing but packing material. No product, no paperwork, just an empty box filled with crumpled paper. But something caught my eye. Buried beneath the packing material was a small camera, pointed directly at me. I screamed. My mind raced. That man wasn't a courier. He'd somehow managed to plant this camera in my home. But how? When? I hadn't left the door open for more than a second. And then it hit me. My apartment building's back door. The one no one used because it led to the alley. I ran to check, my hands trembling, and sure enough, the lock had been tampered with. My blood ran cold. Had he already been inside? I called the police, barely able to get the words out. They arrived quickly and searched the apartment. The officer told me something that made my stomach drop. There were signs that someone had been living in the storage closet down the hall, footprints, some food wrappers, even a blanket. But that wasn't the worst part. The police checked the security footage from the building's cameras. The man had been inside before. He'd been seen around the building multiple times over the last week, loitering near the back entrance. Watching, waiting. He knew my routine. I never found out who he was or what he had planned, but that empty box wasn't just a failed delivery, it was a warning, a signal that he could have done something much worse. I moved out the next day, but the fear never left. Every time I hear a knock on the door now, I freeze, wondering if it's him again, coming back to finish what he started. The Night Shift, a true story of terror. Sarah had always been calm under pressure, and she was a 26-year-old nurse working at a small-town hospital. And after years of night shifts, she thought she had seen it all: drunks from the bar down the street, patients in the middle of psychotic breaks, and even the occasional violent outburst, but none of that could have prepared her for the night that still haunts her to this day. It was a Tuesday evening, around 11 p.m., when Sarah's shift started. The hospital was unusually quiet, the kind of eerie stillness that made the air feel thick with tension. It was supposed to be a relatively easy night, just a few patients on the ward, most of them elderly or recovering from minor surgeries. Sarah had her routine: check on patients, administer meds, then maybe take a few moments to relax with a coffee in the break room. Around 1 a.m., she got the call from the ER. They were sending up a new patient, a man in his mid-40s who had been brought in after a car accident. Minor injuries, nothing too serious, but they needed to keep him overnight for observation. Standard protocol. The man's name was David. When he arrived on the ward, Sarah immediately noticed something unsettling about him. His eyes darted around the room, wide in panic, like he was being hunted. He was covered in scratches and bruises, but that wasn't what bothered Sarah the most. It was the way he clutched his bedsheet, knuckles white, and how he refused to make eye contact. She tried to ask him if he was in pain, if he needed anything, but his responses were short, muttered, as if he was afraid to speak too loudly. By 2 a.m., Sarah was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion. She was about to take a quick break when David suddenly started thrashing in his bed. His heart monitor began beeping erratically, and he was breathing in shallow, rapid gasps like he was on the verge of a panic attack. "Sarah," he whispered hoarsely when she approached. His voice was barely audible, but there was an urgency in it that sent chills down her spine. "They're coming for me." She frowned, thinking it might be the trauma from the accident. "Who's coming for you?" she asked softly, trying to calm him down. He grabbed her arm, squeezing so hard it hurt. "Don't let them take me, please." Before she could respond, his grip loosened and his body went limp. His heart rate stabilized, and he appeared to fall into a deep sleep. Sarah shook her head, chalking it up to the pain meds or lingering shock from the accident, but her stomach churned with unease. At 3 a.m., Sarah was in the break room when she heard it, a loud crash from the hallway outside David's room. Startled, she jumped to her feet and rushed out to see what had happened. The lights in the hallway were flickering, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally against the walls. When she reached David's room, her heart nearly stopped. The door was wide open, but the room was empty. The bed was overturned, sheets scattered across the floor, and David was nowhere to be found. Panic surged through her. He couldn't have just disappeared. He had been weak, barely able to move earlier. She checked the bathroom, the other nearby rooms, nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. She hurried back to the nurse's station to call security. That's when she noticed the security camera monitor. There was David on the screen, walking down the hallway barefoot, wearing nothing but his hospital gown. But something was wrong. He wasn't walking normally. His movements were slow, jerky, like he was being dragged by some invisible force. His head hung low, and his arms dangled limply at his sides. Sarah's blood ran cold as she watched him shuffle toward the old, unused wing of the hospital. That section had been closed for renovations months ago, completely locked off to patients and staff. No one was supposed to be there. Without thinking, she grabbed her flashlight and ran after him. The hallways were dark, the air thick with a musty, damp smell. As she approached the door to the abandoned wing, she felt a chill crawl up her spine. The door creaked open, despite being locked just a moment earlier. The sight that greeted her inside the wing made her stomach turn. David was standing in the middle of the room, facing the corner like a child in trouble. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his body was shaking. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the blood. There was blood smeared on the walls, handprints everywhere, as if someone or something had been trying to claw its way out. And David, his hands were covered in it. He didn't seem to notice Sarah's presence at all. He just stood there, trembling, whispering something under his breath. Sarah's instincts told her to run, but she couldn't leave him like that. She took a shaky step forward, calling his name. "David." "Ah." He turned slowly, his eyes wide and filled with terror. "They took me," he rasped. "They brought me here." Sarah swallowed hard, inching closer. "Who took you?" He pointed to the shadows in the corner of the room. "Them." Sarah flicked her flashlight toward the corner, but there was nothing there, just empty darkness. But the fear in David's eyes was undeniable, and for a moment she felt it too. The oppressive, suffocating feeling of being watched, of not being alone. Suddenly, David collapsed, his body convulsing on the floor. Sarah rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she tried to assess his condition. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently. She screamed for help, but her voice echoed uselessly in the empty wing. By the time the security team arrived, it was too late. David was gone dead from what they would later determine was a cardiac arrest. But Sarah knew it was more than that, and something had terrified him to death. Something he had seen, something in that room. The official report called it an accident, a tragic complication from his injuries. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something far darker at play. He never returned to the night shift after that, too haunted by the memory of David's wide, terrified eyes staring into the shadows she could still feel following her, even when she was alone. The man in the parking lot. I still get chills thinking about that night. It wasn't some paranormal experience, no ghosts, no strange creatures. It was something far worse, something real. It happened just last year when I was out shopping at the mall. I hadn't planned to stay late, but you know how it is. Time gets away from you when you're browsing, and before I knew it, it was almost closing time. The mall was practically deserted, and I was one of the last few stragglers making my way to the parking lot. My car was parked further out since I had arrived late in the day, so I had a bit of a walk ahead of me. As I stepped out of the warm glow of the mall's interior and into the dimly lit parking lot, the sense of isolation hit me. Most of the cars were already gone, leaving vast stretches of empty spaces. It was unsettling, but I figured I was just being paranoid. I started walking toward my car, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the pavement. That's when I first noticed him. A man standing by one of the lampposts in the distance. He was just standing there, looking down at his phone, or so it seemed. I barely gave him a second thought at the time. Maybe he was waiting for someone. But then, as I got closer to my car, I could feel his eyes on me. I glanced over my shoulder, and sure enough, he was staring directly at me. My heart did a little flip, but I tried to play it cool. Maybe he was just checking the time. Maybe I was overthinking it. But deep down, something felt wrong. I quickened my pace, my keys clenched tightly in my hand, and that's when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow at first, then gradually picking up speed to match mine. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to confirm what I was already feeling, but I couldn't help it. I glanced back again. He was following me. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. His pace was steady, and his eyes were locked on me. Panic set in, my stomach twisted into knots. I could feel my legs turning to jelly as I tried to stay calm, tried to convince myself I was just imagining things. Maybe he was going to his car too. But his car never came. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, trying to unlock the door as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. I could hear him now, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, growing louder with every second. I managed to get the door open and practically threw myself into the driver's seat. Slamming the door shut, I locked it instantly and started the engine. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I looked up, hoping he had passed me by, but he hadn't. He was standing right next to my car, just staring through the window at me, his face expressionless. For a moment it felt like time had stopped. He didn't say a word, didn't try to open the door. He just stood there, staring, as if daring me to make a move. I hit the gas, my tires screeching as I sped out of the parking lot. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't stop driving until I was several miles away, parked in a well-lit gas station with people around me. My whole body was trembling, and I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, expecting him to appear at any moment. For days after, I was paranoid. Every time I left the house, every time I walked through a parking lot, I could feel eyes on me. I kept looking for him, expecting to see that same emotionless face staring at me from the shadows. I even started carrying pepper spray, just in case. The worst part, I never found out who he was. There was no report of a stalker or a man harassing women at the mall. It was as if he had just disappeared into thin air. But I know what I saw. I know how real it was. Sometimes late at night I think back to that moment in the parking lot, the way he looked at me, the way he followed me, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made it to my car in time. Would he have attacked me? Would anyone have found me? I'll never know, and maybe that's the scariest part. He's still out there somewhere, and I'll always wonder if he's watching, waiting for another chance. Because in that moment I knew I wasn't safe. Not from some ghost or monster, but from the very real and very dangerous person who had made me his target.